I'm going to thank Dustin for asking me to do this on Thursday and not on a Sunday. I don't know that I have it in me to do this 4 times in one day. So my hat's off to the clergy that are doing that now. That is dynamite. Thank you. Super excited to be here and share tonight. I'm going to start with kind of a personal anecdote. I grew up in Dallas. I was born here. I've spent most of my life here. My family grew up in Oak Cliff. My brother, sister, and I went to school in North Dallas, and my family, my wife and kids, now we live in West Dallas. And so I've crossed the Trinity River 1 billion times. There's this sense when you cross the river as you drive through town that it's always been there and that it's always looked the way that it's looked. And frankly, a lot of us that have lived in Dallas for a long time, kind of feel like the less we think about the Trinity, the less we talk about it, the better. Put a pin in that thought because I'll come back to it. After high school, I went away, as you do. I went out to Chicago and went to college there. And when I was in college, I took a course in urban sociology. It was probably my favorite course in college. But for the final project, the assignment was to write a community study. It was a small class. There were only 10 of us in there, I think. And so none of us were from the same place, and we all chose our hometowns. And so as I started to do the research for that project, I realized I did not know just a whole lot about my hometown. I mean, obviously, we'd been to Dealey Plaza, knew the story of JFK, heard the name John Neely Bryant, had been to the cabin on our 3rd grade field trip to Founders Plaza. They told us that wasn't really his cabin, and that's not really where it was, and nobody knew where it went, but it was there for us to go look at. And so that was kind of a thing that I remembered. Probably most importantly, I'd seen every episode of Walker, Texas Ranger growing up. And so I kind of felt like that was a good place to jump off at. But what I didn't know was how complicated the city's relationship with the river had been. So you might be aware that the Trinity River that we see and drive on these days is not the Trinity River as it's always been. Early on in the history of Dallas, spring rains would cause it to flood, kind of like it does today. But back then, they didn't really know what they knew. So what would happen, the river would flood, it would overflow its banks, it would wipe out residential and business areas. There would be instances where I remember in reading the research for this paper, they said Oak Cliff was only reachable from the city center by boat. Yeah, you imagine that today? So yeah, if you wanted to get to Oak Cliff from the city center, you had to take a boat. And so also people lost livestock, and I think one year there were 5 deaths in this flood. And so this happens enough times, and the civic leaders resolve, hey, we've got to do something about this. So they built a bridge. The first bridge they built was a wooden bridge, and as it went, it was fine until it rained. And until it rained high enough to get to the point where the water was strong enough to sweep the bridge away, and that's what happened. So they said, we got to do something else. We got to do something better. So they built a steel bridge the second time. The second time they built the steel bridge, the floods came, and it washed the steel bridge away too. And so at this point, they're starting to get distressed because the threat of flooding and knowing what it could do, having seen it over and over again, created a tremendous sense of unease and instability, and it hampered growth and it stifled flourishing. For decades, the city tried to live with the river without changing its relationship to it, and they realized that in order for the city to flourish, in order for it to be what they felt it could be, something drastic needed to change. So in the 1920s, they began a monumental flood control project, and what the plan was to straighten and relocate the channel of the Trinity. And if you ever look at satellite, if you ever if you're like me and you like to go on your GPS and look at the satellite maps and spend an hour doing that, you can see like the old channel of the river, where it meanders sort of adjacent to where the channel is now. Rivers don't flow straight like that. If you've ever studied geology or stuff like that, you realize, yeah, they do different things. Not the Trinity River, not anymore, and for good reason. These guys decided it didn't need to do that anymore. So they did that. They straightened it. They moved it away from downtown. They moved it to where it wasn't going to affect residences and businesses. They put the levees up and, more or less solved the problem. The project was far greater in scope than anything they had ever done, but the leaders developed a vision knowing that the city could not become what it was meant to be without a radical realignment of the river. And so it's so weird to me that in learning about the Trinity River for a sociology class that I took in college, I found out that misalignment isn't simply inconvenient, it's destructive. And looking at our gospel text, we encounter a room full of guys who are about to discover for themselves how critical alignment really is. We catch them near the culmination of Jesus' ministry on earth. They've spent 3 years with him to this point. They're not casual observers. Whatever ordinary lives they had before, they gave up to follow him. They've walked all over Israel with him, and yet here they are with him, and they're about to miss the moment. I have a suspicion that the reason they're about to miss the moment is at least in part because of their level of devotion to him. It's cost them a lot. They've given up a lot, and they've trusted Jesus every time he's talked about who he is. Every time he's talked about, hey, I'm the Messiah. I'm the Savior. I've come to set you free. I've come to give sight to the blind, to liberate captives, to heal the sick, to raise the dead. They've trusted him. And so I think part of the reason they're close to missing it is because what's happening to them, and we'll talk more about it in just a minute, is foreign to what they've understood Jesus to be. You also understand it's kind of a freighted concern for these guys. These guys are Jewish, and so they have a long history and heritage of understanding their ancestors were part of the Exodus. Their ancestors were exiled. And so they hear all of their scriptures about a Messiah, and they see Jesus come. And their understanding of what a Messiah is and what he's to do, especially now that they're living under oppression of the Roman Empire, is probably different from what they're about to encounter. There's a shared consciousness just below the surface of who the Messiah is supposed to be and what he's supposed to do that they all have. And it's right there below the surface for them. However much they may have internalized Jesus' kingdom is not of this world, all the times that he said it, they also believe that his kingdom is close at hand. And we see that when James and John ask to sit at his right hand and his left hand. And we also see it earlier in the gospel when Peter says, hey, no, you're not going to suffer and die. However much they've heard from Jesus about who he is and what his kingdom will be like, they still harbor a hope for an earthly victory, for liberation from their oppressors. They have aligned around a victorious Messiah, and he, standing before them, reaches for a towel. Jesus, knowing what is coming not only for himself, but also for his disciples, and knowing that he and they are about to experience what they're about to experience, and realizing, even if the disciples don't, that to meet the moment before them, the alignment they've been accustomed to needed to be upended. The job of washing feet, they understood, belonged to the lowest person in the room. And none moved because nobody believed it was them. Without prodding, without admonition or scolding, Jesus, having taken up the towel, pours the water into the basin and kneels. And he's begun the realignment. It doesn't get too far before hitting a hitch because Peter, who as we all know has a knack for saying just the right thing at the exact right time, tells Jesus, you will never wash my feet. And to be honest, had I been in Peter's, I was going to say shoes, but that, then I might be inclined to say exactly the same thing. The idea of Jesus washing feet is jarring. It's totally out of line with what he and what they would expect their master and teacher to do. And Peter's reaction is a grasping to keep hold of his own expectations as to who Jesus is and what he's there for. It's a resistance to realignment. And Jesus, knowing exactly what he's doing and why, tells Peter in no uncertain terms, what is being offered here cannot be declined. The statement Jesus makes here is clear. This isn't just something that he does, it's something that we must receive. Before you can follow me, you must be served by me. Before you can give, you must receive. Before you can lead, you must be humbled. If you're like me, it's probably at this point you start to realizing this probably isn't just about feet. And while humility is a prerequisite to the kind of realignment that's taking place here in the text, what's going on is about more than that. Being more like Peter than I probably like to read into these passages, I get pretty rigid about the expectations that I have for God. Sometimes to the point that keeping and confined to them feels like a full-time job. Is that relatable? I don't know. Peter's trying to keep Jesus aligned with his expectation, and he probably has his reasons. And honestly, they're probably not all bad. I have reasons to keep Jesus aligned with my expectations, and they may or may not be bad. Sometimes it's easier to not even really examine what those reasons are. But what Jesus offers here is a kind of cleansing that we often don't want to admit that we need. and to accept it is to acknowledge dependence upon him that similarly we often don't want to reckon with. C.S. Lewis famously called God the great iconoclast. And he said that it was God's mercy that leads him to kick down the temple walls that we build so that he can dwell in greater and give us more of himself. After 3 years with Jesus, Peter had probably settled into a pretty well-defined role and idea of what it meant to serve Jesus. And like I said, it probably wasn't all bad. He felt a sense of duty and accomplishment, very likely, in the things that he did and the ways that he served Jesus. But Jesus is prompting him here to a realignment that is going to alter patterns and perceptions, because Jesus knows, even if Peter doesn't, that the realignment must happen in order for Peter to become who Jesus is calling him to be. Being on the receiving end of someone's servanthood can be uncomfortable. Some people might even find it unbearable and try to avoid it. However, the message that comes to the forefront is that we can't serve Jesus like Jesus until we allow ourselves to be served by him. And once we stop resisting being served, everything else begins to change. As realignment takes hold and changes us from the inside, there's a shift that takes place in how we perceive of servanthood that would be impossible without first submitting to receiving Jesus' servanthood. When we become aware of our need, we can then be attuned to the experience of others. We are empowered to rejoice with those who rejoice, to weep with those who weep, to share in triumphs and sufferings as members of the same body. This is a huge shift from the sort of occasional humility and performative service that seems to characterize how servanthood is sometimes approached, often by well-meaning people. When we allow Jesus to realign us through his example of servanthood, as he challenges us to receive acts of service, our lives are reordered in a way that is not only transformative, but unifying. In this realignment, things that held importance to us diminish, and less we compare ourselves to others. Less and less we are concerned with position or status. And instead of resistance masquerading as humility, we freely receive and in turn freely give. And that giving is unaccompanied by any expectation of return or benefit. At that point, we are free. The Trinity River held Dallas captive for decades. It constrained, impeded, and sometimes destroyed. And eventually the city had to face the truth that the river left to itself would always prevent Dallas from becoming what it was meant to be. The old channels, the hope that maybe this time would be different, the misguided belief that maybe now the last bridge we built was strong enough to withstand a flood, they no longer served the community's growth. There was now a demonstrated need to establish new patterns, and the risk of not doing so was exceedingly clear. Similarly, our own old channels, our assumptions about our own strength, our need to stay in control, and the resistance to receiving servanthood eventually constrain, impede, and destroy, just the way the river did. Through this story, Jesus is making clear that he is offering us a reshaped, better alignment that will lead not only to our preservation, but to our flourishing. And that reshaping begins when we are willing to let him kneel before us.